Wow. Um. um, ba-da-boo, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Mm. Hey, welcome to Prelude to Ulysses. I got a haircut. I think I needed it. We're gonna read Welcome to Prelude to Ulysses. We're gonna read This is Alex Reed's Ancient Evenings by Norman Mailer. We're reading part 2, which is Book of the Child, or chapter 3. Yeah. Book of One Man Dead, Book of the Gods, Book of the Child, part 9. Oh, yeah. That's good. I felt good to do that. This is better now. I think I just was cleaning the whiteboard with this stuff. I want to put this away. I think this was fucking my pens up. Well, maybe, I think that maybe I should have waited to hit the start button. But, here we are. 2 minutes in. Oh, fuck, where is it? Okay, cool. So, after a long day of hanging out with Pharaoh, having to freak out, learning he's a psychic, sort of, and maybe he's his grandpa, sort of, maybe, probably not, but maybe. After learning all that, and having a pretty long day hanging out with the Pharaoh, they're all getting kind of drunk. His mom's like calling the Pharaoh a little butt. Pharaoh's fine because it's the Day of the Pig, which I think is a festival where you kind of chill out, quit being such a person, And they've been eating all sorts of weird stuff, like chicken eggs. um, and that's how we learned that. And now the entertainment's coming. Can I read 18 pages? Probably not. Let's find out. So, the Book of the Child, Part 9. A beautiful girl, nude but for a girdle around her hips, entered with a 3-stringed lyre, L-Y-R-E, the musical instrument. Taking no pause, she began to play a love song. How beautiful is my prince, how beautiful is his destiny. Excuse me. Ptah-nemt-hotep gave her no attention, other than to tap the table in time to the music. Hold on. An Ethiopian with a bony body and a flute longer than I was tall, came in behind the girl and began to play as well. While the girl sang, 3 other girls started to dance. Like the lute player, they were naked, but for the girdle that concealed the hair at the head of their thighs. I could not keep from a girdle around your waist, the head of your thighs. Is that your vergruba? I don't. Is he talking about pubic hair? I thought a girdle was in the middle of your stomach. Whatever. I could not keep from looking at their navels and the beauty of their exposed breasts. How bright were their black eyes in the brilliant reflection of the great candles. The lute player sang, "Place sweet oils and good odors in my head. Lay flowers on my limbs, kiss the body of your sister, for she lives in your heart. Let the walls fall down." "Let the walls fall down," sang Hathfertiti in refrain, and patted the buttocks of the servant nearest her, even as the girl was laying flower petals around my mother's plate. "You are darling," said my mother to her, and the girl, reaching into a basket she carried at her hip, passed over to my mother a ball of wax with a delightful smell. Roses, roses and lotuses were in its perfume. I began to understand that we were all to be covered in wreaths of lotus flowers, and that petals of roses would surround our new plates of alabaster, large and clear and milky white. And I also understood that all of this, the girls, the flowers, the songs, and the intimacies of servants, "You are so beautiful," whispered the serving girl to my mother, even as her hip was being caressed, while my serving girl whispered to me, "You are not old enough to know where I could kiss you." Gross. Yes, these agreeable conversations, which I had heard at more than one feast, were not unusual. But tonight they offered a fine fever at just the moment when the pig was brought out to us by two black eunuchs, nude but for their cloths. Yet tonight these breech clouds had been studded with precious stones that could only have come from the Pharaoh's linen. The male servants carried the body on a great black serving dish and set it the body, that's a good way to describe it, it is. And set it on the center of our table in the midst of a quick movement by the dancing girls that had much beating of feet, much undulating of their bellies, and a scintillating play of notes from the three-stringed lyre. The sounds coming in all the quick multitude of some altercation between the birds in the Pharaoh's garden. I was now aware of animals crying out all over the place. A dog first. Here was the pig. I was not ready for the sight. He looked alive and fierce and like a man. I had seen wild boars in their cage, and they were ugly and full of spiky hair matted with filth and litter. Their snouts made me think of the stumps of thieves' arms after the hands had been cut off, or would have, if not the two holes of their nostrils, as dull and stubborn as any two holes you could poke in the mud with your fingers. This pig, however, had his hair shaved off. No, he was peeled. I saw, as I looked at him, and his underskin, now nicely cooked, was pink. His two fangs were covered with gold leaf. His paws had been manicured, and then fixed with silver leaf. His nose had been scraped and painted pink. The buds of white flowers were in his nostrils, and a pomegranate in his mouth. And the servants, revolving around the platter to show all sides of this decorated beast to all of us, I was given a view of the spiral of its tail. Yet before I could demonstrate my cleverness by commenting that the spiral reminded me of the snail, I was treated to another surprise. A small roll of papyrus had been inserted into the pig's well-scrubbed anus. "It is for you to pluck it forth," said Ta-Nem-Hotep to Hathfertiti, with a sweet wash of giggles from the servants, full of delight that they were witnessing the rarest of sights. Hathfertiti gave a kiss to her left hand, and with a flick of her fingertips, plucked the papyrus from its place. "What does it say?" asked Ta-Nem-Hotep. "I promise to read it before the meal is done," Hathfertiti answered with a droll look, as though to give the papyrus time to breathe. "No, read it now," said our Pharaoh. So she broke its seal of perfumed wax, unrolled it, and gasped with delight as a ruby scarab fell into her plate, then touched it for luck to the tip of her nipple before she set it down. She read to all of us, just as slave on the night of the pig. "But may you seek my freedom," to which my father and Menenhedet laughed. Ta-Nem-Hotep and Hathfertiti did not. They stared back and forth with a tenderness so agreeable I wished to sit between them. It was as if there would be no end to the fascinating conversations they might have. All the while, my father looked on with pride, a happy, even a boyish look on his face, as if by these attentions given to his wife, he was receiving an honor he had not wholly earned, while my great-grandfather kept a firm smile on his face until the corners of his mouth looked like two short fence posts, and contented himself by rotating the great round black plate on which the pig rested, as though in this animal there was other messages to read. That also gave me an opportunity to study our roasted monster, who looked like a pink hippopotamus just born, or some swollen dwarf, or now, turned so its head was towards me, looked human for certain. A priest, I thought to myself. I also began to giggle, for although dead, the pig eye near me was open and almost transparent. And it was like looking into a murky hall of marble. Then worse. Somewhere in the hall of marble, a beast stirred. Maybe it was the light of the candles reflecting from those pale, dead green eyes. Maybe the frozen, straining gusto with which the jaws bit on the pomegranate. Or even the voracious thrust of the nose, as if that painted snout were capable of breathing in not only the worst, but the most powerful of smells. At any rate, thinking that something in the immense calm and greed of this dead pig. At any rate, something in the immense calm and greed of this dead pig made me think of the high priest Kem Usha. I felt most peculiar, not a doubt. Cut the creature and serve us, said Tanem Otep. I could hardly swallow at first. My throat was numb with awe. The others, however, would show many expressions. My father, after the first bite, had an absurd glint in his eyes, as if he was trapped between pleasure and exposure. I had seen that look on his face once when I came into his room with my mother. For at that moment he had his hands on a servant, one to the front, one to the rear, and both below her navel. In turn, my mother now showed a troubled expression, as if fearful of dire consequences in all the comforts she tasted. Then I was so bold as to look at my Pharaoh, and he betrayed something like disappointment, as if expecting a good deal more from the meat on his tongue. The music was playing loudly, but he silenced it. The dancers left, as did the lyre player, and the black slave with the long flute. My great-grandfather had another expression altogether. He chewed the food slowly in his strong teeth, strong even for a man of 60. I did not dare to think of 180, and as always, he took the measure of what he did, eating with strong, regular motions of his jaws that produced the same soothing effect on me as the rocking of my cradle, and thereby brought dream. Sorry, just had a thought. Let's see what happens. And as always, he took the measure of what he did, eating with strong, regular motions of his jaws that produced the same soothing effect upon me as the rocking of my cradle, and thereby brought back the kindness that lives in sleep side by side with the most terrible dreams. So I felt lulled by the way he ate, as if no force could shift the center of his heart. That encourages me to take a bite of my own food, but I almost gagged, for the meat was fat and soft and surprisingly intimate in its taste. Something like the confidence of Aya Seab's tongue was in my mouth. The pig knew me better than I knew the pig. I wanted more of this and fatty. I wanted more at once, more of this low and fatty meat, and recollected by way of a little shiver how I had felt once when tasting an atrocious medicine, its ingredients all secret, the worst taste and smell of anything I had ever known, and it made me vomit endlessly. Sorry, I need to read that sentence one more time. I wanted more at once, more of this low and fatty meat, and recollected by way of a little shiver how I had felt once when tasting an atrocious medicine. Okay, I'm sorry. It's secret, its ingredients all secret, and the worst hit, and it made him vomit. Okay, I got it. I had nonetheless known in the peace that followed a smell that lived in my nostrils, warm and soft and sly and even a little dirty. But it was like the taste of the pig in my mouth now. And so I felt as if I was in communion with gods of wet corn, spoiled barley, moldering weeds. Even the odor of roses when they are dead was near to me as I ate the pig. And so I wondered if the pig was an animal, not as alive as other animals, or at least lived closer to death, or to say what I really thought, was stuck in its shit. This is confusing. Is it a person? Chew more slowly, said my mother. Now with the redolence, I'm not going to look it up. I don't know what that word means. Let's just try to figure it out. Now with the redolence of my nose, I watched and admired the delicacy with which the Pharaoh ate, and took instructions from his movements on how to use my hands. Alright, we're going to look up redolence. It's just something that happens from time to time. We gotta get yellow and we gotta get red. Not at once, but Olens. Redolent, having a pleasant odor, fragrant. Number 2, odorous or smelling. Number 3, suggestive, reminiscent. Sure, whatever. With your stinking nose stinker, the sniffer. Sniffed. Okay, nope, we got it. So now with the sniffer of his nose, he watched him use his hands, and that's how he wanted to use his hands. His fingers flew over the food like birds' tongues, and when he chose to pick up a piece of meat before him, it was with one light, precise pointing of his fingers. I think, he said, we have had enough of this creature. One of the servants made a sigh. Yes, Tan-Imhotep declared, it has the most contrary taste. Horus found the pig an abomination, and Set, of course, adored it. I find myself ripped in two by such disagreement among our lords. Now, black servants came in to remove our alabaster plates. And what was left of the pig? I became intrigued with the deft fingers of these servants and the humor of their movement. I became intrigued with the deft fingers of these servants and the humor of their movements. It was then I recollected how furious our Syrian servants had become when my father acquired 6 black slaves trained for use at the table. It meant, even though I understood the importance, that my mother and father were now at a level of splendor equal to the pharaoh's near family. A few high officials and 2 or 3 of our outstanding generals could afford Syrians to bring the food, and blacks to take it away. By way of my mother's teaching, I knew, of course, that the right hand was to be treated like a temple. Indeed, she said with a pout, I would never see a drawing of a noble Egyptian whose right hand crossed his body. That was only for workers and wrestlers. No, the right hand was reserved for bearing arms and touching food, and therefore it was to be washed in oil of lotus before every meal. Whereas the left hand could perform these tasks, we would not wish others to observe, particularly the wiping of oneself, in which practice I was not to linger. I could see that the separation we made between servants who brought food and removed it was connected to the right and left hand. I knew our blacks were not happy in their share of the task. Often I would hear arguments with the Syrians, although dispute could come to no more than grumbling, since sooner or later the overseer of the kitchen would shrug and say, it is the master's orders. Still, I used to think the blacks were remarkable for the depth of the bad mood they could present, and sometimes I would even decide that the poorest black servant had more ability to call upon the foul humor of his gods than anyone but Menenhetit, Kemusha, or my mother, who was kin to both in the power of her worst temper. Tonight, however, the blacks were surprisingly cheerful, and soon burst into giggles. At one moment, I knew no reason for their mirth. At the next instant, I could have told it all. The Pharaoh was eating the very last of his pig, using his left hand. How the blacks smirked. They love pig, he cried aloud as they left the room. They love pig in the land south of us. And he laughed and added, yes, the blacker the skin, the sweeter is the taste of the pork, they say. And he looked around the table. Tell me stories about black people, he demanded abruptly, for I am fascinated with them. Their customs offer light. He thumped his tail for emphasis, as if to tell us that the time had most certainly come to entertain him. And for this I was prepared, since my mother had already informed me that when the Pharaoh wished to be amused, we should be ready with our stories. They must gleam like swords, or be as beautiful as the flowers in the garden. I have heard, said my father, that when an agreement is made on the exchange of property between black chieftains, one spits in the other's mouth, bows, opens his mouth, and receives the other's spit in return. That is how they make the bargain legal. Can you see, asked the Pharaoh, Kemusha and I in such a practice? Pharaoh's funny. He was certainly in a most peculiar mood, in misery, yet most excited. While no one spoke, the air was full of conversation, or so it felt. My thoughts were drawn to his, and never did I enter more easily into his mind. But he had only one word in his head: poison. He looked at us and shook his head. Let us, he said, speak of poison. He smiled at my great-grandfather. Tell me, learned Menenhetit, of its nature. Tell me, learned Menenhetit, of its nature. Now, let's hang on for a second. So the pig wasn't a person. But I think that Menka's little psychic abilities maybe anthropomorphized it a little bit. So they're just eating the pig. Doesn't seem like everyone really likes it. Talking about black slaves. I guess Syrians used to do all the work, or I don't know. It seems like there's certainly caste levels based on skin color in this book for sure. Maybe not skin color, but location for sure. It seems like Syrians are for sure above black people. It doesn't even say where the black people are from. It just says the blacks a lot. It's weird. But so as I was reading this, I was questioning myself. So let's go through this book so far. Guy dies, finds his grandpa. His grandpa's like, you're fucking dead, bro. You're actually like, you're part of your dead body. And then he's like, I'm going to tell you all about the gods and all this weird stuff. And then he takes him and reminds him of this event in his childhood. Or, because they're in the middle of the temple, right, with his grandpa's wiener in his mouth, because that's important. I was wondering if what's occurring now isn't a flashback, as I've been assuming, or is this a trip through the afterlife still? Is this a memory, or is this happening now? and he's like kind of entered into a different realm. Is it? I'm starting to wonder if this is really even on like in reality or on our planet Earth. I don't know. I don't know. I just wanted to say that part. And I was like, "Ooh, what's going on here?" And that's what I was thinking. All right, cool. Let's go. Now he's kind of still in the Pharaoh's brain. He's like, Pharaoh's thinking about poison, and the Pharaoh wants to know about poison. He asks Menenhedet one of its nature. My great grandfather surprised. Okay. My great grandfather. My great grandfather smiled carefully. It is a purity that does not cease, he said to the surprise of all of us. It is a purity that does not cease. Wow, interesting. Until now, he had returned few attempts to bring him into the conversation. I like, said our Pharaoh, the manner in which you bring clarity to difficult matters. The purity that does not cease. Could one describe love in such a manner? I could, said Menenhedet. I have often thought that poison and love may come from the same place. Your remark is malignant, said Hathfertiti. Not at all, said Tanem-Otep. There is something poisonous about the act of love. The pig has put you, good and great God, into a foul mood, said my mother. Oh, not foul, said Tanem-Otep. Poisonous. He thumped his tail once more, one sharp thump to reward the precision of his humor. Yes, he said, poison is everything that we are not. Remarkable, murmured Menenhedet. I must say your mind is remarkable. A compliment, said the Pharaoh. A true compliment from the old dog. Listen to me, you ancient man. You've known them all. Known my ancestors better than anyone, so tell us. Was there one whose mind proved better than your humble Tanem-Otep's? None quicker, said Menenhedet, but stronger in mind? My king of Upper Egypt and my king of Lower Egypt is the strongest in mind, said Menenhedet through the thinnest lips his mouth could form. Oh, let us talk of something else, said the good god. Let us, he looked about, speak of moon blood. But that's awful, said my mother. Have you heard the views of black people on such a matter? He asked. It was obvious she did not wish to accept the subject. I think the children know little of the views and habits of people who live in the lands of the South, she said with a nod of her head at me. Aesiab, having slept with no clothing in my room on many a night, there was little about the occurrence of moon blood I had yet to learn. Once a month, as regularly as the passing of the full moon, she would come to bed for a few days with a girdle around her hips and an odor, no matter how often she bathed, which made me think, if I awakened suddenly, that the river had made a turn in the night and was flowing past our room. I did not dislike the odor so much as I was curious about it, for I had heard the children of our servants whisper to me that all women during the 14 days of the coming of the moon and the 14 days of it going were, at one time or another, deep in the moon blood. And some women were even steadfast on such a course, and always of the same day. I had asked if this was true for my mother and my playmate, the son of the blacksmith in our stables. Well, okay, wait. I had asked if this was also true for my mother and my playmate, the son. Oh, and my playmate, the son of the blacksmith in our stables, acted as if he were in much trouble, for he dropped to his knees and kissed my toe. A disagreeable sensation, since his lips were as chapped and rough from the glare of his father's fires as a lizard's skin. Then he told me that my mother was the relative of a goddess, and so could not have moon blood. I nodded, as if both of us knew this for certain. But in fact, I was puzzled, since I was always hugging my mother's hips and burying my nose above her knees, higher and higher above her knees as I grew older, and I never knew such happiness as then. Certainly my mother smelled of the best oil from the petals of the lotus, but she had other odors as well. and now and again, faint as the scent of one departed fish, there was a hint of the climate of Iaseab on the 15th night of the moon, when I felt as if I had lived in those lands I had never seen to the south, where all the blacks were born, and the trees, half as high as the great pyramid of Khufu, grew foliage to cover the sky, while the plants grew in such heat one could not breathe next to them. So would I feel on the 15th night of the moon if Iaseab was in pain, and I wondered how its light could lay such a wound upon women. It can be seen that the conversation from which my mother wished to shield me could hardly be new to my ears, and Tana-Imhotep not only chose to ignore her protests, but gave a smile to me. Remarkable children must never be protected from what we say, he said, and added, don't you think? To which I replied with a nod, as if the thought were something between the two of us. In fact, I agreed. I always felt as if something dreadful would happen if I could not hear every word at every feast. I had a black slave, said Tana-Imhotep, who told me that in the village of his grandfather they did not allow women full of moon blood near the cattle. I cannot tell you how dangerous they believe a woman to be at such a time. If she touches one of her husband's weapons, he is convinced he will find himself dead in the next battle. They are barbarians, said my mother. Not so certain, said Tana-Imhotep. There is much to learn from them. Even their temples are made of mud. They do not know how to cut a piece of stone, nor how to write, my mother said. Did you ever notice how a slave acts when a scribe is at his pallet? He whimpers like a monkey and breaks into a sweat. Yes, said Tana-Imhotep, but they know of matters we do not know. He paused. From Memphis, should I wish to send a message to Thebes, how quickly could I get it there? Why, by horse, said my father. If there are changes of horse and the riders are still fresh and do not sleep, it could be done in 2 days and 2 nights. More like 3 days, said the pharaoh, but no matter. Further to the south, beyond Kush and Nubia, the same message can be passed through the jungles, and from the summit of one great hill to the peak of the next mountain, and down through the great bush of the valleys across the river. All of this has been described to me. Yes, across distances equal to the 7 days of drifting and rowing down the Nile from Thebes to Memphis, or the 2 or 3 days by horse. Yes, across all of such a distance can the black people send a message in no more than the time it takes for our sun to pass from overhead in the middle of the day to its setting in the west by evening. That is how fast the black people may send a message over such a distance and without roads or trails. I do not call that barbaric. How do they do it? Asked my mother. By their drums, said Tana-Imhotep. They do not know how to write, nor do they know the secrets and skills of our temples. Nor our tombs, said Menenhedet. No, not the cunning work of our tombs, but the black people know how to speak with their drums, and very well. They send their messages rapidly. They are barbarians, said my mother. We do better. We pluck a silent through the air. We do better. We pluck a silent thought from the air. Yes, said my father. Our divine two-house hears many such thoughts. The messages are usually incorrect, Tana-Imhotep answered. What do they mean? What are thoughts to be plucked? To pluck a silent thought from the air. Is the practice of psychic abilities common? The messages are usually incorrect, Tana-Imhotep answered. He began to laugh with sufficient force to thump his tail, yet, so soon as he was done, his face became curious and cruel. At this moment, for instance, a butcher from the markets of Ta has killed his wife in a drunken fit. I see it clearly. Even as he is waiting for his neighbors to seize him, he appeals to me for mercy. I hear him, but I choose to ignore his voice. He is guilty and a brute. The coarseness of his thought displeases me. Yet you have heard him, asked Hathfertidi. Tomorrow, if I make inquiries, I will discover that a murder did take place, but not near the market of Ta. Rather, it was in the poor quarter behind the wall back of the avenue of Ammon. The murderer was a brickmaker, I will discover, not a butcher. And it was his brother he killed, or not his wife, or maybe it was his mother. You see, I receive thoughts from my people, but at what a great rate, and in such a din. If I open my ears, he proceeded to open his eyes, instead with a look of pain, as if all his senses, ears first, had been assaulted by a clap of sound. No, I do not often care to listen with all that is best in me. It is too exhausting. Thoughts, after all, do not travel like arrows, but flutter like feathers and come up one side or the other. So I respect the blacks and their drums. They speak clearly to each other across great distances. I love that concept. It's like the torches of Gondor or whatever. It's cool. It's awesome. My mother said, I too have a story of how to send a message. It concerns the woman who is married to an Egyptian officer, but she is now dead. He is alive and wishes to pass on a few words to her. I heard something delicious in my mother's voice. One needs more than drums for that. She was terribly pleased with herself, as if she had learned at last how to make Ta-Nem-Otep, even in his drear mood, follow her inclinations. Go on, he said. The officer is in love with a charming woman, yet he feels cursed. His dead wife will not forgive him. At night, in the arms of his new beloved, his member will not stay firm. Poor cursed fellow, said Ta-Nem-Otep. I expect the same would happen to me, said my father. It could never, my old friend Nef, said my mother. Do go on, said Ta-Nem-Hotep. Like most army officers, my mother said, he can't stand priests. Yet he is desperate. So this officer goes to the high priest. Do you know the officer? And I cannot say. Ta-Nem-Otep began to laugh with true pleasure. If you were a queen, I would not know what to believe. You would never be bored, said my mother. Nor could I run my affairs properly. I would try to be good for such a reason alone, said Hathfertidi, that the people of Egypt would not suffer. Your wife is charming, the pharaoh said to my father. She is blessed by your presence, said Nef-Kem-Okem. Hathfertidi, our pharaoh said, what did the high priest advise the officer? He said to write a letter to the departed wife, put it in the hand of any good person who had just died. Well, what happened? The letter was sent in such a fashion, and the dead woman stopped haunting her husband. His member is firm once more. Only with great difficulty can a live woman forgive a man. Ta-Nem-Hotep remarked. I think a dead woman cannot. Tell me. Oh, it's funny to have a Tim Allen joke in the middle of this. It's so hard for a live woman to do it. A dead woman definitely couldn't. Tell me what the officer wrote. It must have been a remarkable letter. I do not know what was in the letter. That is not enough for me, said Ta-Nem-Otep. What would you have said? He asked Nef-Kem-Okem. Now, I was amazed by my father. I would have written to my dead wife that I miss her very much, he said. Then I would declare that I feel close to her when I make love to other women. For I do not think of the other woman then, I would say, only of you. Therefore restore my strength. Let it come forth, that I may be near you. I think we can appreciate such a speech more than the dead, said my great-grandfather. Why? What would you have told her? Asked Hathfertidi. I would speak to her as to a subordinate. The dead do not share our strength, you see. They are to us as 1 part in 7, so their curses can be blown away. We need only concentrate on the 1 part in 7. I forgot about that. That is, after all, why few of us look forward to dying. In my letter, therefore, I would list the amulets I could employ against her, and the prayers purchased to me in the temple. Prayers purchased for me in the temple. That should be enough to frighten her. Cold treatment of a dead mate, said Tamemhotep. I do not think we should allow anyone to weaken our member, said Menenhedet. We were silent after his remark. You do not ask me what I would have written, said Hathfertiti. I'm afraid to, said Tamemhotep. I will tell you later, my mother said. The moment has passed. She paused and looked at me. For the first time I felt the point of her cruelty. Ask my son, she said. He has been listening. I said. I could write. I did not know how to finish. Something of the same woe that came over me when I looked into the eyes of the dog was in my heart again. And finally I said, it may be the most terrible story I ever heard. And I began not to weep. I was determined not to weep before the servants, but I sat with my head down and the tears rolling over my face. For I heard my mother's thoughts. I heard the letter she would write. If you do not restore my strength, I will kill our child, was what she would have said. In the time that passed, conversations did not take place, but their silence rose and fell. In this uncertainty, much bruised by the cruelty of the letter my mother would have written, I tried to enter her mind again in the hope she would treat me more tenderly, but was given instead the peculiar sensation of looking out on everyone in the room from the eyes of the pharaoh. Thereby I saw my mother, my father, Menenhedet, and even myself from the pharaoh's seat. That seemed natural, if most peculiar, and I realized that in trying to slip into my mother's head, I had entered, with obvious success, into the pharaoh's thoughts. It could only be due to my mother making her own attempt, at the same moment, to pass into Tamemhotep's mind, and succeeding. Ooh, cool. Looking out through his eyes. God, it's like a telepathic turducken. I'm reading your mind, but you're reading my mind. What the fuck happens then? Do you just implode? All right, let's continue. And succeeding. Looking out through his eyes, it was not hard to comprehend that my mother's powers were hardly smaller than my own. Next instant, this peculiar, agreeable, and natural sensation was gone. Like the noble who touched the pig, I was dipped into the river of the pharaoh's misery. Indeed, it was not misery, he felt, but an emotion for which I hardly knew the word. Kin to the feeling I could fear on the awakening that a wretched event was certain to occur in the day to come, so did I feel the meat of the pig rest like wax in the pharaoh's chest. Not even to his stomach the food descended, and some oppression in this room weighed upon him, some woe before the presence of all things to come, as if indeed he could only keep all troubles from himself until his strength were gone. Feeling as if I had entered a cave where every hue was dark and the purple dye that came from the snails of Tyre, so did I also have the incomparable experience of studying my mother, my father, and my great-grandfather through the pharaoh's eyes. And my family was not as I knew them. Indeed, their expressions were not the same to him as to me. Portrayed on my father's face was a fine cunning I would have never supposed him to have. And Menenhedet showed an obduracy. Obduracy? Listen, sometimes we gotta look things up. Obduracy? Obduracy. How the pharaoh views Menenhedet I. Obdurant. LMNOP. Obdurate. Obdurate. Obdur. Ooh, obduracy. That's actually the state or quality of being obdurate. Oh. All right, we'll read obdurate. 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 Okay, whatever. Unmoved by persuasion or pity, unyielding. Whew. Number 2. Stubbornly resistant to moral influence. Impotent. Impenitent. Impenitent. Impenitent? Impenitent. Impenite. Impenite. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Obdurate. I'm not obdurate. I'm persuaded by the imaginary concept of somebody not liking that. I love that word. Kick ass, dude. And describes Men in Headed too quite well. In Men in Headed, it showed an obduracy as merciless as the power of stone to crush one's flesh. Indeed, no matter how little my great-grandfather had said at dinner, the man Ta-Nehotep saw was more mysterious than stone. A boulder, in truth, that might shatter in a great fall to reveal at its center a gem, or would it be a live scorpion? With just such awe and just such doubt did Ta-Nehotep look at Men in Headed. As for my mother, but for the story she had just told, I would not have recognized her. She looked more beautiful and more murderous than my mother. As for myself, looking on myself through his eyes, I was startled not by my good features, but because I was the brightest little animal I had ever seen, and more alive than I could ever suppose. Yet my face knew such sorrow and horror. I had not expected that, nor was I ready for the love I felt in the Pharaoh's heart when he looked at me, nor for the sudden extinction of such love beneath the awful oppression of the pig's meat in his belly. He's got some stomach issues. And I, on the shift of attention, was put back into myself as abruptly as I left. Ta-Nehotep began to speak, like an oarsman. God, I love him flying into people's heads. It's cool. Ta-Nehotep began to speak like an oarsman whose instinct was quick. He began to talk of matters that could carry me away from such turbulence. The servants began to put out the great candles one by one, and the Pharaoh had time to say many things between the closing of one candle's flame and the long guttering of another. As we descended into darkness, I felt the room become like a cave. He commenced by remarking that my mother's story had an echo of our great kingdom, and made him think of times that had passed. For while my mother, he said, had only spoken of people dwelling among us, or not long dead, yet he found sentiments of such intensity, particularly in the part of the dead wife, reminded him of the great ancestors who had built the pyramids. I need to reread that sentence. So he commenced by remarking that his mom's story had an echo of their great kingdom. What was her statement? That she wasn't even asked what she would say. That's her statement? Oh no, the story. Of giving a note to a recently dead person. Makes him think of times that had passed. For while my mother, he said, had only spoken... Oh. He's actually talking. I'm sorry, I was confused. For while my mother, he's recounting something the Pharaoh said. Since most of this has been written where the language that's used is literally statements and quotations, this is throwing me off a little bit. because it says he commenced by remarking that my mother's story had an echo of our great kingdom, but that's not in quotations or anything. And that's not necessarily how most of this has been written. Does that make sense? When people are talking, it's in quotations when they are talking. Okay, good. I think you got your point across. Thanks. For while my mother, he said, had only spoken of people dwelling among us or not long dead, yet he found sentiments of such intensity, particularly on the part of the dead wife, reminded him of the great ancestors who had built the pyramids. I don't understand that sentence, but I'm not going to dwell on it. I could hardly believe it was the voice of Ta-Nemhotep. He spoke in the solemn measure of Kem-Usha, a slow voice to make me impatient if it were not that the spell of these long, sonorous remarks. He spoke like Kem-Usha in a slow voice to make me impatient if it were not that the spell of these long, sonorous remarks most certainly calmed the uproar of my emotions. After a while, I even began to count how many voices had come out of our pharaoh on this evening. Some shrill, some deep, others coarse or quick. I had heard reflections in no more than the turn of a word of accents that belonged to Bone Smasher or Rava. Which one was Rava? Rava's beer guy? Plus hints of a voice from many a province. I could recognize how fit it was that our good God could, like a god, carry more than one man's voice. All the same, I had no expectation he might also speak like Kem-Usha. It was then I realized that Ta-Nemhotep could not listen to a voice. He did not like without feeling a desire to purge. It was then I realized Ta-Nemhotep could not listen to a voice that he did not like without feeling a desire to purge all reverberations of that sound. So we heard tones of the high priest, but so skillfully that Kem-Usha, wherever he was, must now feel a disturbance of his august calm, and be drawn like a piece of black copper from heaven towards the it's cool, good callback, towards the imitation of himself by the pharaoh. In such a voice, Ta-Nemhotep told the story. Of my ancestor Khufu, he began. It is said that his eye rested on every stone in the Great Pyramid as it was set into place. It is also said he dismissed his little queens of the harem and only kept one wife. To her, Neter Khent, he gave the same loyalty as to his own person. For infidelity, he believed, was his power. Sharing his body with one woman and no other would give Khufu the goodness of two noble souls, each with its 7 parts. Thereby, they would not merely add their force to one another, but multiply it. Khufu, on the consequence, possessed 7 times 7 manifestations of strength. That, said Ta-Nemhotep, is the strength we have forsaken. We do not have the desire to build one great pyramid. We spend our lives on 100 matters. We even conclude that we have chosen wisely. For how can there be a greater risk than to trust somebody completely? Khufu may have been 7 by 7 times stronger than any other pharaoh, but so too was his terror of losing his strength. Because of this, he could not go forth from his palace, without fearing that Ra would enter his wife's body and steal his power. And Khufu even built a tomb in the very center of the pyramid, so that the light of Ra could never reach him. He also left words with his guards that if he should be killed on a visit to the works, Neter Khent would be stoned to death. Whew. Man, this has been one of the best episodes I've ever done. Down to the last page. I cannot believe I've been doing this. I did a good one. That's a good one. Come on. That was okay. I think I'm pretty good at reading out loud. But this was killer. And I fucked it all up just now. Okay. He grew so distrustful of her fidelity. He began to suspect his officers. At last he issued one order. No one in Memphis was to make love without his permission. The populace were obliged to obey. Which common man could trust his neighbors when every sound is heard on the street? And who could depend on the loyalty of his servants to be discreet? All, rich or poor, were obliged to be celibate. This mighty emperor, his tomb greater than a mountain, commanded the loins of men and the womb of women. Tamenhotep coughed delicately into his hand. So, even as Khufu was on his deathbed, he believed that he would never die, since he was now wholly a god. Tamenhotep paused and looked at each of us in turn, giving me a sharp stare of his eyes, as if my attention were as valuable as the others. I have looked for the wisdom, he said, and I've come to the conclusion that a pharaoh, being in part a man and in part a god, must never err too much to one side, or madness becomes his only choice. Khufu erred by seeking all the powers of a god, whereas I may be seeking too few. Now the pharaoh was silent. He moved his lips as if to speak to us again, hesitated, and was truly silent. I knew a change in the evening was on us. All that had been strange yet harmonious, full of little terrors and odd thoughts, would not be disturbed. Waves were rolling across my thoughts from all directions. Indeed, in the next instant, without a servant to announce him, Kamusha came in. Part of that's good. Part of that's not. Where's the picks at? I just have them. I just have those picks. Kamusha staring at the moon. That was dope. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up. It's gonna be an hour full on hour. I wish I didn't waste that time, the couple minutes in the beginning. I don't have much time to explain everything that happened. Okay, so in the book, They brought out the dancers, but then they had the pig, and then the mom was talking about how she'd kill her kid just to get a boner. And then he entered into everyone's head and felt bad, and then everything was weird again. I get